what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're getting started on a baseboard installation that's pretty tricky. I didn't know how I was going to tackle this. It's got a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch dado going through the top here, and it's a full 9 1/4 inches tall. So I have to completely change up my process compared to what I would normally do with 5 1/4 base. So I'm gonna show you what we're doing in this video, lots of tips and tricks along the way. Now, a lot of you guys have seen in other videos, I normally like to cut my baseboard vertically, and I put the profile down, so I actually cut it upside down. That way I can make my miter cut at a 45, and then I can go back to 0 and make my square cut down to where the profile is. It works really good with 5 1/4 base, but whenever you have 9 1/4 inch base, like this here, there's no way you're gonna cut that vertically. So you have to change your process and get ready to cut it on the flat. So we're gonna have to remove these. And this baseboard installation is gonna involve a lot of flipping back here on the back side of the saw. So whenever you get a wrench kind of thrown into your system with something new, I think the thing that separates really great carpenters is they can quickly come up with a system or a process to figure out the best way to install the millwork in the least amount of time and the least amount of motion. So thinking through this, we've got this dado on here, and I didn't know what the best thing was gonna be to do. Do I just miter all the baseboard? Do I jack miter it? Can I cope it? And I ended up coming to the conclusion that the fastest thing was gonna be to just cope it like I typically would a standard baseboard. So here's the problem that this little dado creates. We could square cut this baseboard together, but whenever you put it together like this, you're gonna see that space down in there. That's not something that we want. That doesn't look good. So what we've actually got to do is we've got to cope this profile so that that space will be filled up. And to do that, the end result that we're gonna go through to get this little nub right here, that's what coping is gonna yield us, so that that space will be filled in like so. Not the best cope in the world, but you get the idea. So anytime we cope, the first step in the process is to cut a 45-degree cut on the end of the board. And whenever we cut this at a 45-degree angle, it gives us a line here. I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take my pencil lead to mark this out. And to cope this, we're gonna follow this line all the way around, and we have to make another cut that is square. So you see that pencil line all the way around here now? The next step is to cut this down square or even at a slight angle, and that'll give us this little nub right here. There are a lot of different coping tools that we can use. I'm partial to the Collins coping foot on this barrel grip jigsaw. Now, from this point, I could take my jigsaw and try and cut this line perfectly all along there, but there's a better way. It's much easier to use the miter saw to make as much of this square cut as possible. So I'm orienting my board so that the widest portion of the profile is facing towards me so that I can cut it and go in right up to the point where I want to stop. So let's go ahead and do that now. To finish up the top of the cope joint, we'll use the jigsaw for the rest of it. But this is a full 3/4 of an inch thick. It might even be thicker than that. Yep, it's 3/4 of an inch thick. I could try and freehand it starting off and get a square cut here, but it's a little bit hard to do. It's gonna be a lot easier if I have some kind of a reference line right here to get this cut started with, so I'm marking that right there. So that was a lot of work just to get this little nub sticking out here, but that's what needs to happen with this particular profile. We need it to go all the way through this piece into the back side of this dado, and that's the process that you have to go through to get that. Again, could miter this baseboard profile. I've never been a fan of mitering baseboard. I much prefer to cope because I can snap my pieces in a lot tighter. And that's just my personal preference. So keep in mind, again, we're basically reversing our process and doing a full 180 compared to how I normally do it, cutting vertically, cutting it on the flat here, and having this portion of the profile facing me means that I have to measure the room in the opposite direction and install each piece in the opposite direction. With a typical 5 1/4 baseboard, I'd be cutting it with the profile down here on the bottom, and the larger portion here would be face up. So whenever I'm cutting my cope on the side right here, my cope is actually on the left side. Now, because I'm cutting it flat right here, and I'm tilting my saw over this way, my cope is actually on the right side. So normally, whenever I'm going to cut baseboard and get my cut list, I walk into a room and I start measuring to my left, going around the room clockwise because I'm cutting the baseboard upside down on the saw. Because we're cutting on the flat, the cope is on the opposite side. So in this case, I had to start my measurements on the right side of the room, and I'm actually taking all my measurements counterclockwise. So as you can see here, I've got this room partially installed, and I'm working my way around this way, piece by piece. I've showed this tip before, but a lot of times you'll have a little bit of a gap down here at the bottom. It's very easy to take care of. I like this little pry bar. I'll link it in the video notes below, but I put it underneath there and I twist it, and then I'll take my nailer and scissor nail. So I'll go one direction and then turn the other direction. And that, well, usually it closes the gap. Let's try that again. Okay, we're just gonna scrap that whole thing. I was a little disappointed my tip wasn't working, and I realized that I had no nails in the gun. So we're gonna fill this up, and now you'll see how this is supposed to work. Pry bar under there, give it a twist, scissor nail, and that'll stay closed up. You'll notice that as I'm installing this, I'm keeping the baseboard up off the subfloor. I realize that's a lot different than how a lot of you guys do it in different parts of the country, different parts of the world. Here in Indiana, typically we use shoe molding with our flooring. So in this case, this bedroom is gonna get hardwood flooring. I've got a piece of it right here. It's 9/16 thick. So I like to leave my baseboard 1/8 of an inch higher than what the finished flooring is. So I'm keeping it blocked up 11/16. That gives the flooring room to slide under if it needs to, and then that'll get finished off at the time of the final with a piece of shoe molding across the front like that. So we've got this room cut and installed. Let's go over here to the next room, and I'm gonna show you how we get our measurements to do this. A lot of guys really struggle with getting accurate measurements for baseboard. I've got some tips for you on this. When I start a baseboard cut list, I put a couple marks in the center of my little notepad here, and I just draw a line right down the center. Then I'll actually number it, and it usually goes up to about 30 pieces. We're gonna walk into the room, and you have to think, okay, which side of my board is my cope joint going to be on? In this case, I know it's on the right side of the board, so I know my cope joint's gonna go in here. That means I'm gonna start on this side of the room and go around. So we wanna start off with our first piece being 2 straight cuts. So I've got 3 5/8 on the top right here. I'll write 3 5/8, and I put an S on both sides of my measurement to know that that's a straight cut on both sides. On shorter measurements, I do like to use just a standard tape measure, but for baseboard, you absolutely want to have a trustworthy laser. I use the Leica D-Sto D2 laser. I'll link it in the video notes below. Right here, we've got a really long wall. It's way over 16 feet long, so I know I'm gonna have a splice with a biscuited butt joint in it right here. So to do that, I'll just put my laser down in the corner. I sight the laser dot down at the end, and I'll go ahead and I'll shoot 3 different measurements. And if we come up here and look, again, I shot it 3 times. I've got 331 and an eighth, 3/32, and 3/32. So I'm gonna go ahead and note 331 and an eighth. I got a cope on my right side and I got a straight cut on my left side. And then I know whenever I'm at the saw, I'll biscuit that joint and I'll make 2 different pieces out of that. Little tip, whenever you're doing a really long wall like this, I do like to err on the side of having my piece just a little bit long. That way I can snap it into place and get my corner joints really tight. There is one nice thing, whenever you're measuring baseboard and you're coping all your pieces, your measurements are always gonna be from the long point to long point. So outside of the miter to outside of the miter, it's really easy to keep track of that way. On long pieces, I love using the laser. Whenever I get under about 7 feet long, I prefer to use my tape measure just because I trust my eye a little bit more. A tip on measuring, a lot of guys ask me questions, they struggle to get accurate measurements. A key thing to always pay attention to is where your head, where your eyes are at whenever you're reading your tape measure. If I've got my tape up here and I'm looking at it at an angle like this, I'm never gonna be able to see a really clear picture of what that measurement needs to be. What I need to do is I need to get my head and my eyes perfectly perpendicular to the wall so that I can sight right along this edge right here so that I'm seeing it square, and that's gonna allow me to get a much more accurate measurement. So with my head in the right position here, I can really easily see that's exactly 45.5. All right, let's go back to the saw and cut this stuff up. Little pro tip, for your cut list, always use 2 notepads. That way, as soon as you put one pad up for your cut list, you put the other one directly back into your tool belt. That way you're not forgetting it at the saw. I mentioned this in another video, but I've recently been switching over and using the Forest Chopmaster blade. I had one laying around from many years ago, used it, and I was like, wow, I really like this blade. The thing I like about it is it's really aggressive. So in a situation like this where I'm having to make a bunch of bevel cuts, it puts a lot of, I don't want to say pressure on the blade, but there's a lot of potential for heat buildup, which is going to make your teeth gum up and heat up and go dull a lot faster. So I'm really liking this blade, especially for this type of work, tearing through this material at a 45-degree angle. Now this blade I would not recommend if you're doing pre-finished cabinet type work. It's gonna chip out too much for you, but for raw poplar like this, I'm absolutely loving it. So what is the most efficient way to cut and mark and measure these pieces? I may have this wrong. I'm gonna show you what I'm doing, what I think is the fastest process here. So I'm gonna start with my coped side first. I'm gonna come back here, knock it over to a 45-degree angle. Come over here, we're gonna cut that. Now, one thing you'll notice that I didn't do, and this is a tip for guys who are just starting out, you don't want to just start with your saw back here and just push it down into the material. The reason is when you do that, it's going to cause the blade to wander a little bit. You'll notice whenever I cut, I'm always bringing the blade out and I bring it down just deep enough that the teeth are just underneath the material, and then I push it in. We could probably do a whole video on this topic, how to cut. It's a feel thing. If you push the blade all the way down, that's creating more of an angle, so the teeth are pulling up on the material, and you'll get more chipping on this top edge. So what I do is come in and just keep it just below the surface. Start back here. The other thing you want to pay attention to whenever you're cutting bevels, you can influence the way you're cutting by pushing too hard on the head over. So you want to keep your arm position really neutral so that you're not pulling it one way or pushing it another. You just want to pull back and go straight back in. After we've got our 45-degree cut, we'll knock this back over to 0. And what I want to do, as I showed earlier in the video, I want to find that line on here from my 45, and I want to cut right along that line up to this point up here. So I'll bring my shadow line down, get it just right. That looks pretty good. And we're stopping our cut right before we get to our dado in the profile. Now this is very important. I mentioned earlier that all of our measurements on our cut list are long point to long point. That means our measurements are from the longest point of our 45-degree cut. So before I cope this, I have to make sure that I mark my measurement at least. Typically, I like to mark the measurement and cut it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this down. I'm going to flip it over. You'll see I've got my long point right here, so I can just hook on to that. Take a look at my cut list. I need 180 3/8 strong. We'll come down here, mark that, and I'm just sliding it down and making my square cut on this end, and then we'll go back and cope it. Okay, now different guys will have different preferences. You may want to stack these up and cope all of them at the same time. I don't have a strong opinion at this point on this. With it being such a long board, I don't want to move it around any more than I have to, so I'd probably just go ahead and cope this right now. So kind of a sad but funny story. I knew I had this job coming up with this profile. I hadn't done this profile before, and I asked a friend of mine how he typically handles this, and he said he uses his Coat Master. So I just sold my Coat Master earlier this year because it was taking up too much room. Now I have a 9,000 square foot shop and no Coat Master and this profile to do. So anyways, that's the irony of life. A lot of different ways to do this. If you got a Coat Master, use that. Barrel grip jigsaw is my preference. You can use a hand coping saw, whatever it may be. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm really looking forward to seeing this baseboard all painted up. It's got some great shadow lines, nice clean edges. I do have a question for you before you go. Whenever I get into big 3/4 inch thick baseboard, I'm never quite sure, should I use 2-inch nails or 2.5 inch nails? I just feel like 2-inch nails only have basically 3/4 of an inch of penetration into the stud. That's not quite enough, but 2.5 inch makes me a little nervous sometimes with water lines. So I'm curious what you guys do. Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, we've got a lot more content coming your way from this house, so stay tuned. We'll see you next time.